Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. This is Tuesday, September 17th, 2024. It is Mind Your Banners. It's another Mind Your Banners. He's Mike Niziolek from the Bloomington Herald-Times. Some quick admin for the rest of this week. If you're listening on Tuesday, or I guess any time before Wednesday afternoon, know that men's and women's basketball media days are Wednesday afternoon. We will obviously be there for those. There will be a lot of coverage coming out of those in toward the end of the week and certainly in the weeks to come. But we're recording this specifically around the UCLA game. And Mike, you were at the Rose Bowl, so I'll lean heavily into your experiences there. Fair to say, one of the more impressive road performances, whatever UCLA's quality, that we've seen from Indiana in a long time. I think the Big Ten Network had this as the largest margin of victory for Indiana in a Big Ten game since 2001. Indiana scored on its first two drives. Once it got up double digits, the game was never within a possession again. Kurtis Rourke, 307 yards and 4 touchdowns. He was Big Ten Offensive Player of the Week. Defense had I think 3 sacks and 2 turnovers forced, held UCLA under 250 yards of offense, or 280 yards of offense. I had those numbers. I had that number in my head, and now I've bungled it up. But the point is, the penalties we'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point. But other than that, hard to poke holes in just how good and how comprehensive Indiana's performance was.
I'm going to go off script, even though we don't have a script.
We do not have a script. I did when we first started this podcast. I did scripts, and then I found that we stuck to them so rarely. Not like scripts, but like an outline.
I've never received a script, so I don't.
And we stuck to them like so rarely that I was just like, why am I doing this?
I'm going off script. All right, so you have some perspective, it's historical perspective. You've seen some Indiana teams. I don't know if there's a lot of candidates. Is this the most convincing start for an Indiana team you've seen?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because the COVID season is weird, right? Like the COVID season is hard to put in, like it's hard to contextualize next to anything else. Obviously, that season is different because within the first 3 weeks
they had the 3 Big Ten,
Michigan, and like the Michigan, they stuffed Michigan. Like that game was, thoroughly one-sided. But if you remove the COVID season, the only other season that really kind of compares to it properly, I'll Google 2007 because the vacuum of my mind is starting to lose files that far back. 2007, they opened 3-0, but it's Indiana State, Western Michigan, in Kalamazoo. If you recall a time when Big Ten teams went on the road to play MAC teams, that was before TV money. And then Akron, and then they faced Illinois at home and kind of got run over. Then that was a good Illinois team. That Illinois team went to the Rose Bowl. But then they beat Iowa and they beat Minnesota by a combined 38 points. So that team, started really well. Not like this though. Not in the sense of, the hype and the momentum and to just sort of like meet all of that without breaking stride. Again, even that 2019 team started 0-2 in the Big Ten because they lost at home to Ohio State and then they lost on the road to Michigan State. This is, especially because I don't think expectations were sky high internally at Indiana, but like there was excitement, there was belief, like there was genuinely sort of like hey, like maybe we can go to a bowl game. Maybe, look at the schedule. Kurt Cignetti's experience, whatever. They're kind of meeting expectation. Whereas like 2019, for example, they just sort of got they just kind of got on this run, and suddenly before anyone really thought that there was pressure on them, they were 7-2. This team, I think, is having to manage a little bit more expectation, and it's obviously doing so really well to this point.
So best start ever by far for that you've seen.
That I've seen, I would say so, especially if we can assume a win against Charlotte. Like if we can assume that they don't, they don't just kind of fall flat against Charlotte. To start 4-0, they're going to be on the periphery of the top 25 probably in that case. I doubt they'll be ranked, but they'll be kind of in that also receiving votes category, that Maryland game turns into a really big one as long as they take care of business this weekend. We can talk about that a little bit, or we can save it for next week. But this is probably as good as I've seen.
Yeah, I just and like you mentioned in terms of UCLA, they're down bad. Some of their beat writers were talking about. I just overheard them saying, this might be a team that goes, 3-9 at best. So, obviously the first 2 weeks were,
They're like they're like the anti-Indiana. They have a first-year head coach and a horrible schedule. like these two teams could be roughly equal,
yeah,
and yet like UCLA could not have asked for a much more difficult challenge, whereas Indiana actually gets the benefit for the first time in a long time of a
yeah.
relatively forgiving schedule.
Well, and also, I mean, when you replace a coach late in a cycle, it is hard. That is a challenge to sort of overcome. Now, especially with the portal, that you're sort of blocked from sort of rebuilding the roster, but players can leave. But in terms of let's talk. You mentioned what Indiana did. What was impressive? I mean, really, it was all impressive, right? Kurtis Rourke had his best game, maybe of his career in terms of just, 25 of 33, 307 yards, first 300-yard performance for Indiana, 4 touchdowns, really had protection, had time to throw every time he dropped back, distributed the ball, 7 different players caught at least one pass. Miles Cross got a lot of snaps, most snaps of the season, showed the chemistry he had with them, really attacked the middle of the field. And that sort of set up, I think, the success in terms of the defense. Hard to say. I mean, they did get some, Kamara just was dominant, 7 pressures, according to Pro Football Focus. Didn't have a sack, but I mean, that just was, they harassed Ethan Garbers all day. And they just don't, UCLA doesn't have a run game. So really, I mean, they just, it was very one-sided. Even though the game was, a little bit close for, in terms of the score until they blew it open with those 2 fourth-quarter touchdowns. It was never really a doubt.
I think a couple things stand out to me. One, I think I've dropped this line on you before, but Kevin Wilson used to say, "Your offense is what you can block, and if you can't block it, you can't run it." I think the defensive version of that is probably third downs. If you can't, like, your defense is what you do on third downs, and if you can't stop the other team, then you can call your defense whatever you want. It doesn't work. I cannot remember the last time Indiana was 9 of 12 on third downs in a Big Ten, or anything like that. Like any, substantially over like 50%. And I mean, it
I've never
strikes
seen a
me
line. I mean, you should mention Kurtis Rourke was 9 of 9 on third
for
downs.
128 yards. So it wasn't like 9 of 9 with a bunch of checkdowns because it was 3rd and 3 and 3rd and 2. I mean, like,
and they were
UCLA
averaging.
did a decent job against Indiana's run game. They weren't awful. Indiana rushed for 123 yards, sack adjusted. That's 4.2 per carry. Like, that's not bad. We've obviously seen teams struggle to stop the run through Indiana much more so than that already this season. But like any time UCLA gave itself a chance, like Kurtis
the
Rourke,
average down a distance of those third downs was like 3rd and 10, 3rd and 8 when they had with that Rourke converted. So I mean, it was impressive.
He was. Let me get to this because this stuck out to me. Third downs. Where was it? Maybe they did have it in here at one point. It was something like, yeah, he was averaging 14.2 yards per completion on third downs. Like, that's, I mean, like, that is, I mean, yes, okay, you got to that point where you were getting some 3rd and longs and some 3rd and less than ideal, distances. But like, that's a dominant number to be able to just be. I mean, if you can't stop a passing game from getting 14 yards, like I mean, like 8 or 9 yards would be a bad number on third downs. 14 is insane. And then the other one for me, I think the other really impressive one for me, Indiana's 5 of 5 in the red zone, 5 touchdowns. You can kind of quantify red zone success 2 ways. You can do it on percentages, or you can do it on totals. it's probably easier to do it on totals at this time of year. Some teams have played 2 games, some teams have played 3. So, this was Indiana's first conference game. Some teams haven't played a conference game. Some teams played a tougher non-conference game than what Indiana's played. But the point is, Indiana leads the Big Ten right now in red zone attempts, red zone scores, and red zone touchdowns. And for a program where how many times in the last couple of years were we talking about drives stalling out around the 30, or settling for field goals, or momentum just not carrying over into the red zone? The 2 areas of kind of offensive execution that, other than turnovers, and Indiana hasn't committed one of those yet either, that I think most coaches are going to talk about, just sort of baseline, third downs and red zone. Indiana has been outstanding in both, and they were dominant in both on Saturday.
Well, and I think 2 other stats. I mean, one of them you kind of mentioned, but in terms of the turnovers, 6-0 turnover margin, one of only 5 teams in the country that hasn't turned it over. 2 of those other ones, good company, Ohio State and Georgia. So you could kind of see how important that is. And then the other stat, they haven't allowed a sack in 3 games. And I don't know an easy way to look up, I want to kind of see when the last time that has happened in Indiana. Especially, in recent memory, obviously this offensive line has been really in rough shape to do what they're doing. And part of that, look, the offensive line gets credit. I think the running backs get credit. Justice Ellison bailed, had 2 specifically blocks on a blitz that were blitz pickups that were really important against UCLA. Kurtis Rourke deserves some credit because he's just been really fantastic when pressure does get home, sort of dancing his way out of it and creating. And so I think that sort of speaks to their success right now. They're not turning it over, causing turnovers, and getting pressure while not allowing it. It just seems like they've done all the right things through 3 games, and I think the big question, competition's a little lesser, but still, they have to be happy with just what at a high level they're executing everything that Coach Signetti wants to do.
And it's like little things, I mean, I think play designs have been really good to get the ball out quickly. Like, it's a lot easier to be a good pass blocking team when you're not having to pass block for 4 or 5 seconds very often. I think Kurtis Rourke's feet in the pocket have been quietly really good. I tweeted about that a couple times on Saturday, just like how well he moves away from pressure. He had a 3rd down throw that I think I tweeted out just in a little thread on Sunday to Elijah Surratt. I think it might have been on that first touchdown drive where he sees UCLA pressure coming. It's a good route from Surratt, and even with the pressure, Rourke's eyes just stay downfield the whole time. And he just kind of shuffles a little bit to his left because the pressure's coming from his right, but he never takes his eyes off where the ball needs to go. And, I don't know if it sounds counterintuitive to some people or not, but like, part of the reason he doesn't get sacked there is because he's not bothered by the pressure. Like, if he starts moving, if he tries to spin away, if he tries to take off and run, then the protection might break down and he might get hit. Because he doesn't, because he stays where he's supposed to, he trusts his line, and he trusts his receiver to run a good route, it all kind of works. And we've talked a lot about this team and health, the health of the quarterback position, the health of the offensive line. I said when I picked Indiana to win 8 games in the regular season that a big part of the reason I did was because I looked at Indiana's quarterback advantage against its opponents, and I just felt like Indiana probably had the better quarterback most of the time. That's assuming Kurtis Rourke is the starter. I'm not sure Taven Jackson, I'm not sure there wouldn't be a part of the schedule where Taven Jackson would be capable of stepping in and spelling Rourke and still performing well. I think he's improved a lot, but it's less of a sure thing because you don't have just that tonnage of 5 years and however many hundred 1,000 whatever snaps, reps, yada 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 that a 6th-year quarterback is going to have. And I think you see, like, Ethan Garbers was not an inexperienced guy. He's in his 4th year at UCLA. He was one of their go-to guys last year. He was their quarterback when they won the bowl game, when they won their bowl game. Um, but I mean the gulf in class between him and Rourke was, frankly, one of the kind of deciding factors of this game. One of them was just like two steps ahead of the opposing defense pretty much the whole day. The other one had some good moments, a couple good throws, some good scrambles. Indiana lost contain a couple times, but never really looked like he was in control of the game in any meaningful way. And, like you talk about, it's, in some ways, the sort of the sequence of scoring is almost more impressive because it's not like Indiana just blitzed UCLA and then held on. Indiana gets out ahead. It takes advantage of its opportunities with some long drives early, the fumble, obviously, but then it's just kind of methodical from there. It's very much sort of like by design of once you get ahead, this is how you win a game when you're up 21-7 or 21-0 or whatever. This is how you turn a touchdown drive into a field goal drive. This is how you answer that. This is how you finish. Like comprehensive is the word I just kind of kept coming back to. And I don't know if any one player sort of symbolized that better than Rourke.
Yeah, I mean, they were far and away the better team, and had a better plan. I think we talked about in terms of coaching. I think it made just a huge difference in terms of Deshaun Foster being a first year guy, trying to figure out what his sort of team looks like. Obviously, he's got new coordinators, one from the NFL and Eric Bieniemy. Whereas, Kurt Signetti brought a staff that he's comfortable with and had been executing the same thing for the last, in terms of these coordinators, together for the last 3 or 4 years. And it just made, I thought that gave them sort of like a 10-point advantage, and it turned out to be a little more than that. You could just see, I think, how clear an advantage that gave them on Saturday. I just thought that was obvious from sort of the get-go. I mean, look, that fumble was sort of unlucky for UCLA. Hit the guy when he was trying to throw it back, but I don't think that made a difference. I think this would have been this would have unfolded.
It was an execution thing though. Like
Yeah.
it was an RPO that I think the
But I'm
running
saying, regardless of the fumble, I think that this would have unfolded very similarly if they
yeah,
had.
no, that's fair. Yeah.
That was my point. Yeah.
The other thing too, and I mean, you don't want to overdo this, but I mean, obviously I was watching it from home. Um, the last kind of moment that stands out to me in the game is when UCLA is down 28-10. There's that drive across the end of the third quarter, the beginning of the fourth quarter, that has the roughing penalty that I still don't understand. It has the D'Angelo Pons targeting, which you can feel is harsh if you're an IU fan, but like it is. I mean, it is by letter of the law. You understand why it's called. The point is, Indiana kind of had UCLA bottled up a couple times on that drive. It got extended by some penalties. Some were mistakes by Indiana. Some felt a little bit unfortunate. One way or the other, it did feel like that was kind of the one moment in the game where UCLA had the wind in its sails a little bit. And if UCLA scores there, they're still down 11, and that's why I say you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to make it more than it is, but it's still kind of one of those things where they're down 11, but they're at home. There's still most of the fourth quarter to play. All it would take is a defensive stop and another score, and Indiana would suddenly be in that territory we've seen Indiana teams in the past where it's like, it's all happening again. Instead, Indiana digs in. That's an 11-play drive, and it takes more than 6.5 minutes. Indiana digs in, forces the field goal, gets the ball back, and puts together basically the exact sort of drive you would want to respond to that 10 plays, 75 yards, 5 minutes and 45 seconds. And that's it. That's the game. And that, I have had, you ask about like historical perspective and maybe how this is being digested, I guess, almost, among IU fans. I've had more people point that drive out to me since, with some iteration of the idea that, like, Indiana teams in the past, that would have been a problem. They would have allowed a touchdown. They would have allowed themselves to be a little bit disheartened. and maybe it would have opened the door for UCLA to come back and make it a one-score game again, make it really stressful again. That this team not only kind of dug in and stopped UCLA, held them to a field goal, kept a 15-point advantage, and then turned around and just kind of landed a haymaker right back. That like I said, the overwhelming sentiment I've gotten from people I've talked to who are football fans is like, that's not the old Indiana. That this team has a different mentality about it.
Well, I think you saw it last year in terms of this team struggling with kind of responding to teams or adversity late in the games. I mean, down the stretch last year, Purdue, Michigan State, Illinois, they kind of bounced back, but then they, fold in overtime. I mean, there were countless examples of sort of, this team just sort of struggling in those situations. And this team, like you said, kept its head on its shoulders through some, really questionable, you talk about targeting calls I had no problem with, except the non-targeting call, which I did not understand at all, on Aiden Fisher, who took an absolute blow to the head.
They explained it was that they've narrowed. I'm doing this with my head. They've narrowed the area where like the helmet to helmet, like that, if it's not like a launch or whatever.
I mean, it was a launch, but he did launch.
I mean, I thought he did too, but it's a certain like circumference of the helmet, and this is like this is my more philosophical problem with like the way we've allowed replay.
What are you gonna do? Get a tape measure? Because it's
like we used to.
If a guy has a bigger head, then he has more chance.
The ground can't cause a fumble. Like that was the simplest. Like if a player went down and the impact with the ground caused the fumble, we said the ground can't cause a fumble. Now, because of replay, we have to ask, like, is the wrist down? Is the elbow down? Like, what is down? What isn't down? When does possession begin to be lost? Like, and we've done this with targeting where we've created all of these, like, layers, and we've just made it more complex. Like the D'Angelo Pons one, by the letter of the law, I understand why it's targeting, but the spirit of the law or the spirit of the rule, I think a player would be justified in saying, I can't keep all of the nuances that we've added to this rule straight. But what I know is I'm not supposed to lead with my helmet when a guy's coming at me over the middle. And he led with his shoulder. And it's sort of like, then, like, what?
No, that one, well, no, I thought you're not, no. That one was, I thought, you can't, on a defenseless player, you can't lead basically with anything.
Yeah, I mean,
But to jar a ball loose at his head, to spear his head, and like that, I'm fine with, because that is what causes concussions, right? Eliminating that kind of hit is what is the goal. But that's the same thing that happened to Aiden Fisher, and it was the most violent hit of the game. And they're lucky that Aiden Fisher didn't get a concussion. And I thought that was probably the worst of the calls. But I mean, the roughing the passer calls were both really, right there.
The roughing call on Jalen Walker felt like bad luck. He hit him on the shoulder, and then his arm came up to his head.
His arm bounced off his shoulder.
I agree, but in
we're talking
like a split-second moment, all a referee's gonna see is
the head on the thing. But I mean, like,
I understand that one.
The
Linnell Carr one. I mean, like,
I
turned into the Joker. Like, I painted my face and danced down the stairs of my house. I was just like, as someone who was a bad defensive lineman in high school, I was like, man, the only good moments I ever had looked exactly like that. You can't tell me that's not football. Like, come on. You're
being totally insulting to Linnell Carr. The podcast apologizes to Linnell Carr's family, but no, he like
the passing. Terry McCauley.
All he did was tackle him. All he did was tackle him.
Terry McCauley explained that it was something to do with the quarterback being in a passing posture, and that he's a defenseless player when he's in a passing posture. Now, two things. Number one, he's not. If you watch the replay, and you do have to slow it down, but if you watch the replay, Garbers feels Carr coming and begins tucking the ball to protect it. So he's not in a passing posture when contact comes. Number two, he is, my understanding of that interpretation of the rule is that passing posture is only supposed to matter below the knees. That it's supposed to stop guys from going for a quarterback's legs and endangering the
But I don't
possibility of
even
a knee
like
injury
regardless
when he's not protecting himself.
regardless of all that, all he did was tackle him to the ground. Like there
It
was
is hard
nothing.
to rough the passer when the player doesn't pass the ball. It doesn't feel like roughing the passer if the quarterback doesn't
All
pass
he
the ball.
all he did was tackle him to the. He sacked him. Like and there.
Roughing the
Well,
opponent.
because then his other thing was is like, well, he let it. He fell on him on the ground and drove him to the ground. He was. I mean, that was just the nature of how the angle he took. Like, I mean, there was no extra. There was no. It was a bad call. It was a terrible call. And all of them, went against Indiana, and they just sort of said, it doesn't matter.
Did
We're
you
just
see
gonna
what Signetti called them
Mickey
on Monday?
Mouse.
Mickey
Mickey
Mouse.
Mouse.
He called them Mickey Mouse. For what it's worth, I don't know if this will be like publicly confirmed or not. I think one of those may be getting overturned just for the suspension purpose, and it really doesn't matter
Can they
that much.
add? Can they? In terms of because we were talking about the ACC didn't, to my knowledge, didn't reverse calls. Like, can they add a call? Can they reverse that non-targeting to a targeting on the UCLA player? No,
I don't think so. No.
So they can't add the target because they NFL can,
No,
right?
I mean, I see this in soccer where there are certain instances where after the fact a a yellow card or a red card, really it's a red card, can be reviewed and rescinded.
So but they can't raise. But I mean, the NFL
No,
fines.
they can't. I've never known it really in any sport like that kind of retroactive punishment. Certainly, like intensifying punishment, like if it was particularly egregious, but not like no punishment was given or it went through the review process in the big, because it's also, people should also remember this now. The Big Ten has a replay center. None of this is done on site anymore. The referee's not looking in the hood or whatever. Like all of this goes back to a replay center in Chicago. So all of this is coming down from the Big Ten office directly. So like if the Big Ten was to say, and it is weird because I keep thinking, oh, it's not a Big Ten problem because it's IU UCLA, but like that's a Big Ten game now. If the Big Ten was to say, basically retroactively, we're punishing that UCLA receiver, then what they would be doing is subverting their own process because it was literally the Big Ten officiating center that went through that and said it wasn't. And I don't understand how it wasn't targeting. I
So
don't
there
buy
was
this idea that
failures and
there are suddenly
failures on
parts
multiple
of the
levels.
helmet
I
that
hope
are
the
dangerous.
screenshot. I hope the screenshot of this video is you with
Me
the
putting a crown
crowning
on my
yourself
head,
champions
crown
of
of
some.
thorns for targeting.
So yeah, I mean, a bad, poorly officiated second half.
I will say, in general, like Indiana still had a lot of penalties they need to clean up. Like they had some holding calls. The pass interference on Pons was very clear. He grabbed Jersey while the ball was in the air. I mean, if you're Kurtis Rourke, like you can make your complaints to the league office, and you can even lock 3 or 4 of these off of whatever. You're still in a situation where I think if you're Indiana, you should look at this and say, hey, 2 or 3 games now, we've had 8, 9 really correctable mistakes that would cost us in another situation. And I think that's something that Indiana has to, like, it's, you can, and honestly, like the other thing I would say is you should complain about officiating after a win because it doesn't sound like sour grapes. It doesn't ring quite as hollow. But in the same breath, I think it is worth saying Indiana still had plenty of unforced or at very least sort of like correctable errors of its own in that penalty column that now Indiana's played 3 games, 2 of them penalties have been an issue. I think Kurtis Rourke would be within his right to sort of talk to his team and just say, we have got to clean that up. It cannot be something that sticks with us through the course of the season.
Yeah, the number, I mean, it was insanely high and has to get fixed. But I mean, the most egregious penalties were just not part of that. Is I think the bigger point.
And that's where, again, I think Indiana deserves credit for sort of its composure. And I mean, like, the Pons targeting and the roughing the passer call, I think both came on that same drive, just either side of the quarter break. And, in theory, that drive should have stopped long before it got into like the red zone. So
I did
I mean,
have
like,
the numbers. That was the I looked this up on Saturday. It was the most IU penalties since they had a program record. Did you cover this game? 19 against South Carolina State in 2001?
I did not cover that game.
2011.
Oh, then
2011.
yes, I did cover that game. That was the only game they won that year. So that was
So that was, and then the most penalty yards since Bowling Green in 2014.
I was not at that game either. I wasn't on the football beat yet. I was only doing basketball. David Woods was at that game. I went home to take my dad to a Georgia Southern football game.
So there you go.
There you go. Georgia Tech won, but what are you gonna do? We don't need to do too much on Charlotte. I do find it amusing that Braylon Mullins took his, if I'm not mistaken, he took his North Carolina official last weekend, and North Carolina plays Charlotte, if I have that right. And now he's going to take his Indiana official this weekend, and Indiana's going to play Charlotte. Like, is there anybody else on the planet that isn't an employee at Charlotte, a student athlete at Charlotte, or related to by blood or relationship someone involved with Charlotte football that is going to be present in person for both of these games other than Braylon Mullins? I'd like to know who that is.
So we're in agreement that this should not be a trap game in terms of overlooking this.
No, it probably helps. I mean, like, Kurt Signetti mentioned this. He mentioned like they had a couple games close last year. He also pointed out like late third quarter, it was something like 21-13 or something like that, or 24-13 in that game against North Carolina last weekend. So, it probably helps Indiana maybe get anybody's attention who needs it, so to speak, if you understand what I'm saying. But I mean, Indiana, I think, opened as a 24, 25 point favorite. I wouldn't be shocked if this is another game where Indiana doesn't cover, or just in terms of, I guess I don't know exactly where that FIU line closed, because I think that Elijah Green touchdown late may have covered for some people, depending on what your preferred sports book is. But this feels more like a game where it's more just kind of like the bare minimum, just don't take any risks, essentially. Because I mean, man, that if let's live in a world where Indiana wins this game, that Maryland game is huge. I was thinking about this yesterday, after talking to somebody about it. It took Tom Allen longer to get to this point, but it feels a little bit like that Cincinnati game in 2021 that sold out and actually was going well for a while until a targeting call against Micah McFadden. And the game really turned around after that. And that was the Desmond Ridder Cincinnati team that eventually went to the playoff. I think if provided even decent weather, Indiana's probably going to sell that game out or come close to it. That Maryland game, that's going to be the kind of game where I think you can get fans to stick around, especially if it's competitive. Maryland's given Indiana some trouble in the past. Mike Loxley's, always had good offenses. He's always had athletes. I think Indiana's probably a better team than Maryland, but that's going to feel like one of those games where, it's not like it's all over if you lose it, but like you can win a lot of fan base trust that starts to make certain things become a little bit more implicit or inherent in terms of behavior from your fan base if you can win it. So I think Charlotte is about like bare minimum, nobody gets hurt, no risks, no screwing around, because that Maryland game, not just for the complexion of this season, but in some ways for the relationship between your coach and your fan base, becomes, I think, really important in a way.
Well, and it will derail the game day coming here on October 19th for the Nebraska game. So you got to lock that in.
By game day, I think you mean Big Noon Saturday. Because
you really think if both Nebraska and Indiana are undefeated on October 19th, game day will ignore Kurt Signetti.
Hold on a second. October 19th. Let's see what we got here. Let's see who else is playing. So Miami will be at Louisville. No, Georgia will be at Texas on October 19th. So that is where game day will be.
Okay, so that might be hard.
Yes.
I think that's a direct. I think
Alabama will also be at Tennessee that day. So Fox Big Noon kickoff.
What?
It's
So
like game day,
you're
but
saying
on a
Indiana's
different channel.
you're saying Indiana's not and Nebraska's not bigger than that. Nebraska back? No.
I mean, it's close. It's close. It's one of the storied rivalries of the Big Ten. It goes back to when Scott Frost said a bunch of offensive stuff right to Tom Allen's face at a Big Ten coaches and ADs meeting.
Is that true?
Yeah, no. So Indiana beats Nebraska in 2019, and Tom Allen's real fired up and like emotional about it. And part of it was because his son Thomas got booed during the game because he went down injured, and Nebraska fans thought he was slowing down their no huddle offense. And it
Okay.
turned out he had like a dislocated hip or something, like he
Oh,
needed like
yeah, yeah.
surgery and 9 months rehabilitation. So Thomas mad about that. But then the other thing that happened was at and we'll make this quick because we're running out of time. At a Big Ten coaches and ADs meeting, not long after he got the job, Scott Frost got up to complain about scheduling pairs. And he said some teams get to play Indiana while we have to play Michigan. And every coach and every AD was in the room. And like Indiana wasn't super offended by it at first, but then like nobody was like, hey, listen, it was his first one. He's feeling himself. Like, no harm, no foul. We're sorry about that. And I think there may have been a couple of instances of negative recruiting here and there, different. But like the big one was like Scott Frost was just like, just flip the bird to Indiana. And Indiana was just like, what did we do? Like, we just drove up here, man. Like, what's going on? So then like Indiana won the game, and Fred Glass told, I think it was me, I think I was the one that got the quote, that said like it was particularly sweet given some comments that Nebraska made about our program that we went and beat them. So anyway, we'll leave it there. I think we may have a special Mind Your Banners later in the week. You're not gonna be on that, I don't think. Um,
What?
you fulfilled your quota for the
I
week.
got dismissed?
Yes. Well, you're sick
Wow.
apparently. You're wiping your nose.
Wow.
You came back. You came back with the Pacific flu. Uh,
Wow.
the Oregon Trail didn't treat you. The reverse Oregon Trail did not treat you well. We will be at men's and women's basketball media day tomorrow. Again, heraldtimesonline.com, indystar.com/sports for all that. Charlotte over the weekend, and then a big one next week. This has been Mind Your Banners for September 17th, 2024. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.